Welcome to the Nourish to Thrive podcast, faith-forward, science-backed strategies for women who want more energy, less weight, and real answers. I'm your host, Tanya Pennington-Miller, a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and functional blood chemistry specialist with a master's degree in applied clinical nutrition. If you're tired of feeling dismissed by your doctor, confused by your labs, and stuck in survival mode, you're in the right place. Here, we simplify the science. We get to the root, and we anchor it all in truth, because God made your body to heal and thrive, not just survive. It just needs the right kind of support and less noise. Hello, my friend. Welcome into the Nourish to Thrive podcast. I'm so glad you're back with me today. So we are continuing our cholesterol talk as it pertains to women of a certain age. And at the end of last week's episode, I suggested that when you hit play on this one, that if you have your labs handy, to have them in front of you. So if you did that, perfect. Just follow right along. And if you don't have them in front of you, totally fine. You can just take a listen today and then grab those afterward if you feel like there's something that you do want to look for or want to compare. So either way, you're going to walk away today with a lot more context for what your lipid panel actually means and some additional markers that are not on the standard lipid panel. So this is the second episode of our 3-part series on cholesterol. And this one, I've really been looking forward to this one because this is where we get into the numbers that actually tell the story. There's an important distinction to make here that I'm sure many of you are familiar with by now, but some of you might not be. And that is, there is a difference between the reference ranges that are written on your lab report and actual optimal ranges. And so I'm going to be speaking to that distinction throughout this episode. So a reference range is what your lab report uses to determine whether your results get flagged as high or low. And it is built from a population average. And like I said last week, that population includes a lot of people who are not functioning optimally. So being within a reference range means you're not at the extreme end of a general population. It does not mean that your numbers are where they need to be for your body to actually function the way that it should for you to be able to feel your best. An optimal range is very different. It is the range that's associated with the best health outcomes, with the lowest risk and the best physiological function. And in the functional space, that's what we're going for. So as we go through these markers today, I am going to be giving you both, kind of what the standard is and the functional optimal ranges are, and what I am actually looking for when I read labs for the women that I work with. So let's start where most conversations start, which is total LDL, which we talked a lot about this last week. I want to be very clear that our LDL is not a useless number. Like, it does give us something, but like we talked about last week, it's just a count. It tells you how many cars are driving on the highway without telling you what kind they are or how they are driving. And most standard panels start flagging LDL as high, somewhere around 100 milligrams per deciliter. Now, in the functional space, we actually consider LDL up to around 120 milligrams per deciliter to be in an acceptable optimal range. But I do want to add that that is only when the context supports it. And that context is everything that we are going to be talking about in this episode. The particle pattern, the ApoB, your triglycerides, your insulin, your inflammation, because an LDL of 120 with pattern A particles, a low ApoB, and clean metabolic markers is a very different situation from an LDL of 120 with pattern B particles and elevated triglycerides. So we're going to talk about all of that. So rather than chasing a specific LDL number, what I want you to be focused on are the markers that give you the full picture. Okay. HDL is the one marker where we actually want it higher than what your lab report says. So let me explain the reasoning behind that. HDL has a reverse cholesterol transport function. And what that means is that its job is to pick up excess cholesterol from tissues and from arterial walls and carry it back to your liver for processing. And what I mean by processing is the liver is going to convert it into bile, and that bile eventually gets excreted out of the body through the digestive system. And to be more clear, I'm talking you poop it out. Okay. So essentially, HDL is the reason cholesterol can leave your body at all. Higher HDL means better cholesterol clearance and better excretion. Most labs are okay with HDL as long as it's not under 40 milligrams per deciliter, but I really don't want to see it under 55, okay, at minimum. And I'm really looking for something closer to like a 65, maybe between 65 and 70. And a low HDL alongside high triglycerides is a pattern that tells me a lot about the metabolic and hormonal environment, even before we look at anything else. Now, this is a good place to also talk about total cholesterol, because total cholesterol is the number that shows up right at the top of pretty much all standard lipid panels, and it tends to cause a lot of unnecessary alarm. Here's the really important thing to understand about total cholesterol is that it includes your HDL. So if your total cholesterol number went up, it is entirely possible that it went up because your HDL went up. And that's actually a good thing. So a woman who has a total cholesterol of 210 with an HDL of 75 is in a very different situation from a woman with a total cholesterol of the same 210 but has an HDL of 45. Same total number, completely different story. So total cholesterol on its own tells you even less than total LDL does. And yet, unfortunately, our total cholesterol is often the primary number that doctors are looking at when they decide that someone has high cholesterol and they start the conversation about the statin. Okay, let's move on to triglycerides, which are one of the markers I do pay really close attention to on this panel because it tells me a lot about what's happening with blood sugar and insulin in the background. So I want to clear something up before we get into the numbers because there tends to be a really common misconception here. High triglycerides do not come from eating animal fat. They come from eating excess sugar and refined carbohydrates. When your body has more carbohydrates and sugar than it can use for immediate energy, the liver converts the excess into triglycerides and stores them. So if your triglycerides are elevated, the question I am asking is not how much butter are you eating? It's how much sugar and refined carbohydrates are in your diet and how well is your body managing your blood sugars right now. A standard lab is going to flag triglycerides high when they get above 150 milligrams per deciliter. What I want to see is below 100. And ideally, I'd actually like to see this closer to an 80. Triglycerides that are running high, even if they're within the quote unquote normal range, are one of the early signs of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. They are also directly connected to LDL particle pattern because high triglycerides tend to drive the conversation of large, big, beautiful, buoyant LDL toward the small, dense LDL. We talked about that last week as well. So if your triglycerides are elevated, your LDL pattern is likely shifting in a direction that you don't want it to. Okay, we talked a little bit also last week about ApoB in the Q&A episode, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper here because it's such an important marker. So ApoB, which is your apolipoprotein B, is a protein that sits on the surface of every atherogenic particle in your blood. And because every one of those particles carries exactly one ApoB molecule, the ApoB number gives you the total count of all potentially dangerous particles. Not just LDL, but VLDL and IDL. So now we know not just how many cars are on the freeway, but now we know how many dangerous cars are on the freeway. Much more valuable information. Now, most labs consider ApoB to be normal if it's below 90 milligrams per deciliter. I would really like to see it below an 80 to be optimal. And some cardiologists now consider ApoB to be more predictive of cardiovascular risk than total LDL, precisely because it counts all of the atherogenic particles and does not just focus on one type. Unfortunately, this is a marker that does not tend to be run on a standard lipid panel. So here is one that a vast majority of women are never going to see on any panel from their conventional doctor, because conventional medicine really does not run this particular marker, and that is fasting insulin. And yet it's one of the most important markers in the entire cardiovascular conversation. Insulin resistance is one of the primary drivers of the small, dense LDL pattern, of elevated triglycerides, low HDL, and the kind of metabolic dysfunction that increases cardiovascular risk. And insulin starts rising years before blood glucose does. So by the time your blood sugar looks problematic, by the time we see that A1C rising, your insulin has often been running high for a very long time. I mean, this is incredibly valuable information for us to have and should be run on standard labs. Now, conventional labs might consider fasting insulin normal up to a 25. Okay. What I'm looking for is somewhere between like 2.5 to 6. Okay. And we start to see signs of insulin resistance when we're creeping up around an 8. So I want you to hear that again. Standard labs might consider up to 24 to be acceptable here. And I'm looking for somewhere between 2.5 and a 6. And I start to really pay attention when we get to 8. Okay, that gap is significant, and it's where a lot of metabolic dysfunction is happening under the surface. It's really important that we get our insulin tested. Okay, let's move on to some inflammation talk. So HSCRP, which stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein, is your inflammation marker. And I do want to make sure we clarify something here, because we have both CRP and then we have HSCRP, and they're not the same, even though they measure the same protein, but they're two separate tests. Okay. One is high sensitivity and one is not. So regular CRP is a less sensitive assay, and it picks up acute inflammation. So things like active infections, injuries, autoimmune flares, like it's really useful in an acute setting to detect what I would call active fire. HSCRP, the high sensitivity CRP, uses a much more sensitive assay, and it picks up that very low level chronic inflammation that would not even register on a regular CRP. So it's detecting that the smoldering embers rather than the big active flame. And it is that chronic low-grade inflammation that is directly relevant to cardiovascular risk. So when it comes to your heart health picture, HSCRP is the one that you want, and it is so worth asking for, specifically if it's not already on your panel. I mean, the American Heart Association actually recognizes HSCRP as an independent cardiovascular risk marker, which means it's not just a functional medicine add-on. Like, it's a real clinical standing, and your doctor should be willing to run it. Now, a standard reference range considers HSCRP below a 3 to be considered acceptable. What I'm looking for is below 1 milligram per liter. Okay. And ideally 0.5. I mean, I'm thrilled when I see a 0.3. Okay. An elevated HSCRP in the context of elevated LDL is a very different situation from an elevated LDL with a perfectly clean HSCRP. The inflammation piece changes the risk picture significantly. And here's exactly why that combination is so significant. Let me tell you what actually happens to your LDL when inflammation is present. So LDL becomes oxidized when it's exposed to oxidative stress. And that oxidative stress comes from chronic inflammation, from high blood sugar, from processed seed oils, from refined fats that oxidize easily, from chronic stress, from environmental toxins. When an LDL particle gets oxidized, it changes structurally. And your body's LDL receptors can no longer recognize it properly. So instead of being cleared the way it should, kind of lingers around a little bit longer. And the big problem with that is your immune cells, specifically a type called macrophages, they see oxidized LDL as foreign and damaged. And because of that, they try to engulf it, like to try to get rid of it. But then they end up taking in too much and they turn into what are called foam cells. And these foam cells accumulate in your arterial walls and they form fatty streaks. And those fatty streaks are the beginning of arterial plaque. So oxidized LDL is much more directly connected to the process of atherosclerosis than regular LDL is. It is the piece that actually causes the damage. And this is also why the small, dense LDL pattern we talked about earlier matters so much. Small, dense particles oxidize more easily than the large, buoyant ones. So if you have pattern B LDL, the small balls, and elevated hsCRP at the same time, you have particles that are more vulnerable to oxidation sitting in an environment that promotes it. That combination is what I'm paying the most attention to. Oxidized LDL can actually be tested on its own, but it's definitely not on a standard panel. But some functional labs will run it under the name OXLDL. And if you're someone who has elevated LDL, elevated hsCRP, and elevated triglycerides, it can be a really useful piece of the picture. Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time on this next marker. This one is called Lp(a). It's lipoprotein(a). It is a lipoprotein particle that carries its own unique protein called apolipoprotein(a). And it's distinct from LDL in some really important ways. So first, it is almost entirely genetically determined. And because of that, you really only need to run it once in your life. Your Lp(a) level is going to be what is based on your genes. And running it every year is not going to be able to change that. Okay, if it's elevated, it's elevated. If it's not, it's not. And that genetic piece is also why lifestyle changes, the things that move your triglycerides and your HDL and your LDL particle pattern, those things do not significantly lower your Lp(a). So, why does this matter? Because elevated Lp(a) is an independent cardiovascular risk factor. It is pro-inflammatory. It is prothrombotic, meaning it promotes clotting. And it is associated with an increased risk of arterial disease in a way that goes beyond what your other lipid markers are capturing. Now, labs measure Lp(a) in two different ways. So when you look at your results, you may see it reported in milligrams per deciliter, or you may see it as nanomoles per liter, depending on which lab processed your blood work. So if we're talking nanomoles per liter, elevation starts roughly around 75, and significantly elevated is above 125. If yours is in milligrams per deciliter, elevated starts around 30 and is significantly elevated around 50 milligrams per deciliter. Now, I do want to be really clear here because I know that I just told you that lifestyle changes are not going to bring down your Lp(a), and I understand that that might feel a little bit scary, but I want you to hear this. There is still something really meaningful that you can do, and it changes the picture significantly. Because you cannot lower the Lp(a) number itself through lifestyle, what you are going to do instead is create the healthiest possible terrain around that elevated marker. And here's why it's so important. Lp(a) does its most damage in the context of inflammation, of insulin resistance, of oxidized LDL, and elevated triglycerides. So if you are doing everything you can to keep your inflammation low, to keep your insulin optimized, your triglycerides in a great range, and your overall metabolic health in good shape, you are significantly reducing what that elevated LP little a can actually do. The gene is there, but the environment you create around it determines how much it expresses. And this is exactly why knowing your LP little a is so valuable, because it does not tell you that something bad is going to happen. It tells you that you need to be more diligent about the things that are within your control, more diligent than the woman next to you who doesn't have an elevated LP little a. Okay, it's just the reality. Okay, let's move on to something called the NMR lipid profile. This is the most complete picture of your LDL situation. And we did introduce this in our Q&A episode last month, but NMR stands for nuclear magnetic resonance. And what this test measures is not just how much LDL you have, but how many LDL particles you have and how big or small they are. So this is how we're going to find out if you've got really big balls or if you have really small balls, okay? The two patterns you will hear about are pattern A, which I've been referring to, and pattern B. Pattern A means your LDL particles are predominantly large and buoyant. You have big balls, okay? This is the pattern that we want. Think of those big beach balls that we talked about last week, okay? Large particles that are less likely to get lodged in your arterial walls. Then we have pattern B, which means your LDL particles are predominantly small and dense. And these are the particles that oxidize more easily. They penetrate arterial walls more readily, and they drive the inflammatory cascade that we are actually worried about from a cardiovascular standpoint. In terms of LDL particle number, sometimes it's written as LDL-P. A reference range might consider anything below 1,000 nanomoles per liter acceptable. What I would be looking for is ideally somewhere between 700 and 800 nanomoles per liter. And if someone has a higher total LDL, but pattern A particles and a lower particle number, then we know that's a very different picture from someone with a pattern B and a higher particle number. There is a way to interpret these labs, and it is certainly not based on one number. So let's pull all of this together, because these markers absolutely do not live in isolation. They tell a story together, and learning to read that story is what functional lab work is all about. Here is what a favorable picture looks like. An LDL particle pattern A, LDL-P below 700, ApoB below 80, triglycerides below 80, HDL at or above 65, fasting insulin between 2.5 and 6, and HSCRP below 0.5. When a woman's labs look like that, even if her LDL is elevated, I'm not concerned. And even if her LP little a is elevated, I'm not concerned, because the metabolic terrain around it is healthy. The inflammatory environment is clean, and the pattern is protective. Here is what a concerning picture looks like. Pattern B LDL particles, an elevated ApoB, triglycerides above 100, HDL below 55, fasting insulin creeping up over 8, and an HSCRP above 2. That pattern, even with an LDL that looks acceptable, tells me something is happening metabolically that needs attention. And this is why we so often hear about someone who's had a heart attack and they say, but my lipid panel looked great. There was nothing alarming on there. Well, we didn't test enough. So when you're looking at your labs, I want you to look at all of these markers together rather than fixating on one single number. And if your doctor is only focused on LDL or total cholesterol, now you have enough information to ask better questions. Ask about ApoB. Ask about fasting insulin. Ask about HSCRP. Ask if you've ever had an LP little a run. These are reasonable, clinically grounded requests that you should have the rights to. These are all things I run for my clients, whether you're working with me one-on-one or you're in my DNA Reset for Fat Loss Academy, because I know that not enough women are having these run with their conventional doctors. This is why I always say I step in where your doctor stepped out. Psalm 139, 13-14 says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And I think about that verse in the context of LP little a specifically, because LP little a is one of those markers that is written into your genetic code before you ever took your first breath. God knit that into you. It was part of the design. And I know that it can feel heavy if you find out that your number is elevated, but I want to offer a different frame. The God who knit you together also knit in every other system that we have been talking about this month. Your liver's ability to produce LDL receptors, your body's ability to regulate inflammation, your metabolic capacity to maintain insulin sensitivity. He designed all of it with the same intention and the same intelligence. Knowing your LP little a is elevated does not mean something went wrong in your design. It means you have information about your specific design, and you can work with that design in a more informed and intentional way. That is stewardship. That is the work of someone who takes seriously the body she has been given. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And even in the places where our genetics present a challenge, the capacity to respond wisely was built in right alongside it. I hope today's episode gave you a whole new way of reading your labs, and I really hope you were able to have them in front of you as we went through all of this. Next week is our final episode in this series, and we are going to be covering what actually moves the needle here. We're going to talk about diet, about lifestyle, targeted supplementation with real evidence behind it, and we're also going to touch on some of what people are exploring on the research and peptide side as it relates to metabolic and cardiovascular health. It's going to be a really good episode. And if you're thinking seriously about understanding your own cholesterol picture at a deeper level, including how your DNA influences your lipid metabolism, your inflammatory pathways, your metabolic response, this is the exact work we do inside my DNA Reset for Fat Loss Academy. I will leave a link to the waitlist in the show notes. Enrollment opens early 2027, which will be here faster than we realize. But being on that list does also get you information in the meantime. So thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I will see you right back here next week, sister. That's it for today on the Nourish to Thrive podcast. If you found value here, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or send it to someone who's walking a similar path. Keep showing up, keep asking questions, and know that healing is possible, especially when you trust the one who designed your body to heal. Until next time, stay rooted in truth and nourished in grace.